Then, another point. The decision to intervene is subject, like all political decisions, to the influence of pressure groups. Just as with domestic legislation, foreign policy will be shaped by the pressures exerted by various minority constituencies with their own axes to grind. Meanwhile, the interests of the public at large are lost in the shuffle. This is the basic teaching of the school of public choice, which in my mind they've gotten too much credit for, because it is a basic teaching of classical liberalism going back to the 18th century. Consider a particular domestic statute, say a particular tariff or farm subsidy. Most often, fewer than 1% of the American people have an interest in high prices. Everyone else has an interest in low prices. How is it then that the tariff or subsidy is adopted to keep the price high? The reason is that the benefits of the high price policy are concentrated while the costs are diffused. So the special interest group spends time and money and votes to make sure it gets what it wants. Similarly, in foreign policy, it cannot be emphasized strongly enough. By and large, the American people have virtually no interest in foreign affairs. They know nothing about foreign countries, their histories and problems. They care nothing about them. With most of the countries the U.S. government has attacked and invaded in recent years, the majority of Americans could not even locate them on a map. In truth, no people was ever less suited to be an imperial nation than the Americans. Inevitably, therefore, the policy of global meddling will be determined not by the American people themselves, but by small groups and cliques, which do care and care a lot. Do such groups and cliques exist? Yes, of course they do. There's, first of all, those powerful individuals and corporations with foreign financial interests who use the agencies of the government, the State Department, the CIA, U.S. military, and so on, to protect their interests and thus socialize the costs of doing business abroad. Sometimes I used to point out to my classes that for years, the Rockefeller family kept a foreign policy consultant on retainer, a professor at Harvard named Henry Kissinger. I used to ask the students whether their families had a foreign policy consultant. It will be interesting to see what happens when the time comes to privatize the Iraqi oil industry, whether the American and British and other oil companies will pay for the costs of this privatization. The aircraft carriers, the helicopter gunships, the F-16s, depleted uranium munitions and cluster bombs and all the rest of it. Another classic example are the American Zionists, really right-wing Zionists allied to the Likud party in Israel. Nowadays, these ultra-Zionists are by no means limited to people of the Jewish faith, and by no means are all members of the Jewish faith in this camp. Probably the so-called Christian Zionists are more numerous, people like James Dobson. He's the head of the group Focus on the Family, a greatly influential organization. He's seen on TV stations all the time and has intimate access to the White House. I have to confess that over the last few years, I've become more and more curmudgeonly, maybe as befits my age. So I've come to consider a number of people who disagree with me in politics to be crazy. But these Christian Zionists are really crazy. Later in our conference, my friend Dr. Lawrence Vance will explain to you what a true Christian policy is, based on someone sort of there, that terrorist who was tortured by the Romans. The power of the Zionist lobby in America is detailed in the scholarly paper by John J. Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, which you can access on the internet. In fact, there's more freedom to criticize Israeli policy in Israel than there is in the United States. As you can see, for instance, from the columns by Yuri Avneri and Ron HaCohen on Justin Raimondo's indispensable website, antiwar.com. There are other cases of pressure groups exercising influence on U.S. policy as well. The Cuban-American community is very important in determining the electoral votes of Florida. It's been pivotal in keeping the embargo on trade with Cuba going for decades, despite its being obviously counterproductive and stupid. When Clinton decided to send troops to Haiti, that's been forgotten too, to return Father Aristide to power, his decision was influenced by the clout of the Black Caucus in Congress. This in spite of the fact that the overwhelming majority of Americans had not the slightest interest in restoring democracy in Haiti. That's what it was called, Operation Restore Democracy in Haiti. They really have no shame. Fourth, let us, aside from all this, suppose that a meddling foreign policy would be formulated by competent leaders who never exploited for personal political advantage, who were somehow immune to pressures from special interests. Still, the world is an exceedingly complicated place, really very complicated. Inevitably, there will be unintended negative consequences of U.S. interventions. This is what is known as blowback. The only person who never heard of it seems to be Rudy Giuliani. We went to war in 1917 to make the world safe for democracy. The result was the Versailles Treaty, the rise of Hitler, and World War II. We helped drive the Soviets out of Afghanistan. The result was the coming to power of the Taliban. The outcome of American support of Israel and other interventions in the Middle East has been to turn millions and millions in the Islamic world into enemies of the United States. And the effect of that is that some fanatics, murderous fanatics, came over here to attack us on our own soil. And now there are men in Washington and elsewhere speaking of the inescapable coming war with Islam. Now, fifth, there is the damage done to our constitutional system by foreign meddling. This was outlined in classic form by William Graham Sumner in 1899 in his essay titled, "The Conquest of the United States by Spain." You can read some excerpts from the essay in the archives of Freedom Daily. Sumner wrote, "We have beaten Spain in a military conflict, but we are submitting to be conquered by her on the field of ideas and policies. Expansionism and imperialism are nothing but the old philosophies of national prosperity which have brought Spain to where she is now." Sumner went on to outline the original vision of America cherished by the Founding Fathers, radically different from the one that prevailed in the European nations of the time. We would have no court, no pomp, nor orders or ribbons or decorations. Thomas Jefferson rode to Washington, to the city of Washington for his inauguration all by himself on his own horse. We would have no titles. They would have no public debt. There was to be no grand diplomacy because they intended to mind their own business and not be involved in any of the intrigues to which the European statesmen were accustomed. This had been an American idea. It was our signature as a nation. And Sumner said it is by virtue of this conception that the United States has stood for something unique and grand in the history of mankind, pardon me, and that its people have been happy. The system the founders bequeathed to us, as Sumner held, was a delicate one, providing for the division and balance of powers and aimed at keeping government small and local. It was no accident that Jefferson, Washington, and others who created the Republic issued their clear warnings against foreign entanglements.